Dale Frisch, who had been running the grain elevator in Kiowa, Kansas, and writing up wheat tickets for 29 years, said later that he did not realize, when Nora Hess pulled her John Deere 9500 combine up to the scale on the morning of July 14, 1996, that anything unusual was happening. She was a farmer bringing in wheat. The elevator opened at 6. She was there at 6. He wrote the ticket and read the moisture and weighed the load and handed her the slip, and she pulled around and augured the grain into the receiving pit and drove back to the field. It was the 4th load that morning before he looked at the slip carefully. The field was running 68 bushels per acre. He checked the moisture reading again. He checked his own arithmetic. He walked to the door of the scale house and looked at the combine sitting on the scale, and then looked at the number on the slip again. 68 bushels per acre on hard red winter wheat in Pratt County, Kansas, in the summer of 1996 was not a number he had seen before. Not from this farm, not from any farm in Pratt County, not, as far as he was able to determine over the following days of asking around, from any farm in Pratt County, Kiowa County, or Barber County in a year anyone could point to in recent memory. The farm was 400 acres. It belonged to Nora Hess. She was 38 years old and had been running it alone for 14 months, since her husband Roy had died of a heart attack in May of 1995, leaving her with the land and the equipment and a note at the Farm Credit Office in Pratt and 2 children in middle school, and the unsolicited opinions of every farmer and neighbor and farm credit officer in 3 counties about whether she could manage it. She could manage it. Stories like this don't get told much anymore. If you grew up around people who worked with their hands and didn't say much about it, hit subscribe. We're going to keep telling them as long as you keep watching. Pratt County sits in the south-central part of Kansas, hard red winter wheat country, flat and open, the kind of land where the sky is the dominant feature from October through July, and where a person driving the county roads in the summer can see a combine working a mile away and judge by the dust and the swath width roughly how the crop is running. The county had about 10,000 people in 1996, most of them in Pratt, the county seat, and most of the rest on the farms that covered the county in the particular geometry of section line roads and quarter-section fields that makes Kansas farmland look, from the air, like a green and gold chessboard pressed flat by the weight of the sky above it. The Hess farm, 400 acres in the north part of the county, had been in Roy's family since his grandfather homesteaded it in 1912. Roy had taken it over from his father in 1982 and had farmed it with steady competence. Not exceptional yields, not innovative practices, but solid management, paid bills, the farm in good condition when he died. The equipment was maintained. The John Deere 9500 combine was 3 years old and running well. The 2 tractors were a John Deere 4440 and a Case IH 5140, both in workable condition. The note at the Farm Credit Office in Pratt was $67,000, reasonable against the value of the land, serviceable on the farm's normal revenue. None of that was the problem. The problem, in the estimation of the people who had opinions, was Nora. The opinions came from various directions and in various tones. The Farm Credit Loan Officer, not the same man who had written the original note, but his replacement, had called in June of 1995, a month after Roy's funeral, to ask about Nora's plans for the operation and to mention, in the careful way of a man managing a difficult subject, that there were options if she decided the operation was more than she could handle. He was not unkind about it. He was doing his job as he understood it. 2 of Roy's farming neighbors had stopped by in the weeks after the funeral and offered, in ways that were genuinely well-meaning, to help with decisions they assumed she would find overwhelming. A man named Darrell Cohn, who farmed the section to the east, had suggested, at the co-op in the fall of 1995, that Nora might want to consider cash renting the ground to an experienced operator rather than trying to run it herself. None of them asked her what she knew about wheat. She had grown up in Stafford County, 2 counties east, on her parents' farm. She had worked alongside her father from the time she was old enough to drive a tractor, which was earlier than the school district would have preferred if the school district had been consulted. She had married Roy in 1983 and moved to the Pratt County farm and worked it alongside him for 12 years. She knew the farm, the equipment, the ground, the crop rotation, the elevator schedule, the custom harvesting arrangement with the freezing crew out of Medicine Lodge, the seed representative's name, and the soil map for every field on the place. She had copies of the soil maps in the same filing cabinet that held the farm's tax returns and the equipment maintenance records. This was not what the people with opinions chose to see when they looked at her situation in the summer of 1995. They saw the age, 38. They saw the gender. They saw 2 children in middle school. They saw a note. They saw risk. Some of them saw it with genuine care. None of them, in the spring of 1995, were asking what Nora Hess knew about wheat, or what Arlen Voth had put into her over 20 years of farming alongside him. Her father, a man named Arlen Voth, who had farmed 640 acres in Stafford County for 40 years, had taught her to farm in the way that farm fathers teach daughters and sons who are paying attention. Not with formal instruction, but with proximity, repetition, and the gradual transfer of decision-making authority as the child demonstrates the judgment to carry it. He had given her the spray decision on the winter wheat when she was 15. He had given her the fertilizer rate calculation when she was 17. By the time she graduated from high school, she was making most of the in-season agronomic decisions on the Voth farm, with Arlen reviewing and occasionally revising them, and the revisions were getting rarer. Arlen Voth's wheat management was specific and careful in a way that was not common in Stafford County in the 1970s and 1980s. He had started doing tissue testing on his wheat in 1971, when the practice was new enough that the county extension agent had to explain to him how to submit samples. And he had used the results to adjust his in-season nitrogen and micronutrient applications in a way that most of his neighbors did not bother with, because the bother was real and the benefit was not immediately obvious until you looked at the yield maps over time, which Arlen did, every year, on a hand-drawn grid he kept in a 3-ring binder. He believed, and the yield maps supported, that wheat managed precisely, variety selection matched to field history, seeding rate calibrated to soil type, nitrogen time to the plant's actual need rather than a calendar schedule, consistently out-yielded wheat managed conventionally, and that the advantage compounded over years as the management built on itself. He had taught Nora this, not as a philosophy but as a practice. You do the tissue test, you read the result, you adjust the application, you compare the outcome to the previous year and to the neighboring fields. You build a picture over time. Nora had brought this practice to the Pratt County farm when she married Roy. Roy had been receptive. He was not a man who resisted ideas that made sense, and they had been doing tissue testing and variable rate fertilization on the Hess farm since 1986. The yield maps were in the same kind of 3-ring binder Arlen used, updated every harvest, 1 page per field per year. When Roy died in May of 1995, Nora had 10 years of yield history on every field on the place. She planted the 1995 winter wheat, the crop that would come off in the summer of 1996, in October of 1995, 5 months after Roy's funeral. She made the variety selection herself, going with a hard red winter variety called 2137 that the Kansas State Variety Trial data suggested had a yield advantage in her specific soil type and disease pressure environment. She calibrated the seeding rate by field, lower on the heavy ground that historically ran dense stands, and higher on the sandier acres in the northwest corner that needed more plants to compensate for lower tiller survival. She applied the pre-plant fertilizer based on soil test results she had run in August, and she scheduled a late-season nitrogen application, a practice called top dressing, for late February, before the plant broke dormancy, which is when applied nitrogen has the highest uptake efficiency. She did all of this alone, with her 2 children helping on weekends when the work allowed it, and with a hired hand named Calvin Shoup, who worked 3 days a week and who had been on the place since 1990 and who knew what needed doing without being told most of the time. She was not exceptional in her practices. She was precise. That was the difference. Not luck, not special gifts, Not a secret variety or a proprietary treatment. Precision. The same precision Arlen Voth had practiced in Stafford County for 40 years and had put into her. The winter of 1995 into 1996 was favorable. Good moisture, moderate temperatures, no late freeze events to damage the wheat at jointing, and the crop went into spring in excellent condition. She put the top-dressed nitrogen on in the third week of February, timing it to a forecasted rain event that would move it into the soil quickly. The rain came. The nitrogen moved. The wheat broke dormancy in March with a kind of even, vigorous tiller development that tells a person paying attention that the season is setting up right. She kept notes through the spring. Stand counts, tissue tests in April, disease scouting reports she did herself walking the fields every 2 weeks, fungicide application timing based on the disease triangle, host, pathogen, environment, the way she had been taught to think about it. Calvin Shoup drove the sprayer. She walked ahead of it calling the rates. By the time the wheat headed out in late May, she knew she had a crop. She did not know she had a record because the records were not something she had been tracking against. She had been tracking her own fields against their own history, field by field, year by year, the way the binder had always been used. She had not been racing her neighbors. Dale Frisch at the Kiowa elevator did not know any of this on the morning of July 14, 1996. He knew the number on the slip and what it meant in the context of 29 years of writing wheat tickets in Pratt County. He mentioned it to the first farmer who came in after Nora that morning, Gordy Unruh, who farmed east of town and who was running 52 bushels on his best field, which he considered a solid year for his ground. He mentioned it to the next farmer, and the next. By the time the morning rush slowed down around 10 o'clock, Dale had asked 6 farmers what their fields were running, and not one of them was above 58, and most were in the low to mid-50s. He did some rough math on the back of a ticket stub. The county average for Pratt County in the 5 previous years had been in the range of 48 to 53 bushels per acre. A 68-bushel field was not just a good year, it was a number in a different category. He called the Pratt County Extension Office at 10:30 and left a message for Stephen Kraus, asking if he'd heard anything about the Hess farm yield. Stephen Kraus called back in the afternoon and said he hadn't heard yet, but would drive out. By noon, the number was moving through the county in the way information moves through a small farming community during harvest. Fast and specific, and with the particular electricity that attaches to something nobody has seen before. A farmer who had told his wife over breakfast that Nora Hess wasn't going to make it through the year called her at noon to mention what he'd heard at the elevator. He did not connect the two conversations, or if he did not say so. Darrell Cohn, who had suggested at the co-op the previous fall that Nora might want to consider cash renting the ground, heard the number from a neighbor on the afternoon of July 14th. He drove his pickup to the section boundary between his ground and the Hess Farm North Field and looked at the stubble on her side of the fence for a while. His own field, on his side of the fence, was running 54 bushels. He did not mention to anyone what he had done on that afternoon drive. His wife told me about it later. The Pratt County Extension agent, a man named Stephen Kraus, who had been in the county since 1988 and who had a reputation for being direct in the way of people who have spent years trying to get information to move through farming communities that are polite about ignoring it, drove to the Hess farm on the morning of July 16th, 2 days after the first load hit Dale Frisch's scale. He asked Nora if he could walk the fields and look at the stubble and ask some questions. She said he could. She brought the 3-ring binder. They walked for 2 hours, moving through the north field and the west quarter and the sandier acres in the northwest corner that she'd seeded at the higher rate. Stephen Kraus asked about variety selection. She told him the 2137 trial data that had informed her choice and showed him the page in the binder where she had compared 3 variety candidates. He asked about the seeding rate calibration. She showed him the field-by-field rate table she had calculated in August, based on the soil type maps and the historical stand count data from the previous 3 years. He asked about fertilizer timing. She described the tissue test results from April and the top dress application and the timing relative to the forecasted rain event in February. He asked about the fungicide decision. She walked him through the disease triangle calculations she had done in May, the assessment of host susceptibility, pathogen pressure from the weather data, and environmental conditions, and the timing of the application relative to heading. He took notes on a legal pad throughout. He did not say much while she talked. He asked follow-up questions that were increasingly specific, the questions of a man who is trying to find the edge of someone's knowledge and is not finding it where he expected. At the end of the 2 hours, standing in the stubble of the North Field, he said, "You've been doing this for a while." She said she'd been doing it since her father started teaching her in Stafford County in 1975. He wrote up the results in the Pratt County Extension newsletter that fall. 2 pages, specific, naming the farm and the practices and the numbers. He described the tissue testing, the variable seeding rates, the top dress nitrogen timing, the disease management protocol. He called the results significantly above county average, rather than a record, because he had not done the historical legwork to use the word record responsibly. And Stephen Krause was a man who used words responsibly. 3 farmers called the extension office the following week to ask about tissue testing. 2 more called in January before the next wheat season. One of them, Gerald Cohn, who farmed the section to the east, drove to the extension office in person and asked Stephen Krause who he should call to get started. Stephen Krause gave him the lab contact and the sampling protocol and the name of the agronomist in Hutchinson who consulted on variable rate applications. Darrell Cohn left without mentioning that he was the same man who had suggested the previous fall that the Hess farm ground might be better managed by someone else. Nora ran the 400 acres for 11 more years. Each year she updated the 3-ring binder with the new yield data and refined the management decisions for the following season based on what the data showed. The yields varied with the weather. A dry year in 1999 pulled her down to 58 bushels when the county was averaging 41. A wet spring in 2002 pushed her to 64 when the county ran 55. But the gap between the Hess farm and the county average, which had been 15 to 16 bushels per acre in 1996, held in the range of 12 to 18 bushels across the following decade. It was not luck. It was not exceptional weather. It was the gap that exists between precise management and average management, compounding year by year the way Arlen Voss yield maps had shown it compounding in Stafford County since 1971. Her daughter, a woman named Kelsey, joined the operation in 2007, fresh from Kansas State with a degree in agronomy and the specific advantage of having grown up walking fields with her mother and understanding what precise management looked like from the inside before she had the academic language for it. Her son Travis joined in 2010. The farm became what it had always had the capacity to become: a 3-person operation with 3 decades of documented yield history and the knowledge to use it. Nora sold the place in 2019 to a neighbor who had been waiting for it patiently and paying attention to when it might become available. The price per acre reflected what the land had become under 34 years of precise management, not just the topsoil depth and the water rights and the equipment infrastructure, but the documented history, the binder, the accumulated knowledge of what specific management decisions did to specific fields in specific conditions. That history was part of what the buyer was buying, and he knew it, because he had watched the Hess Farms yield numbers for 20 years from his section to the south and had drawn his own conclusions. She is in her mid-60s now, in Pratt. She keeps a garden. She still has the 3-ring binder. Arlen Voth is 86 years old. He still farms 160 acres in Stafford County with help from 2 of his grandchildren, which is the appropriate number of acres for an 86-year-old man who has been farming the same ground for 60 years and is not ready to stop. He was at the Hess farm on the morning of July 14, 1996. He had driven over to help with the harvest logistics, the way a father drives over when his daughter is running harvest alone. And he was sitting in the truck at the field end when Nora came in on the combine at the end of the 3rd pass, and he could tell from the way the grain tank was sitting that she had a crop. He did not say anything about the yield until Dale Frisch's number got back to him that afternoon. Then he drove to the field where Nora was combining, and he pulled up alongside and she stopped the machine, and he got out of the truck and walked to the combine ladder and looked up at her. He said, "That's a good crop." She said, "I know." He got back in the truck and drove to the next field to watch the rows. That was the whole of what was said between them. It did not need to be more. 40 years of tissue testing and variable nitrogen rates and 3-ring binders full of yield maps had been moving toward that July morning since before Nora Hess knew what a yield map was. Arlen Voth had been paying attention for 60 years. He had put what he knew into a daughter who was paying attention, and she had carried it to different ground, in different weather, and a different set of problems, and the ground had answered. Not luck, not exceptional gifts, just attention, maintained across generations, until the morning the numbers came in.